Between 180 and 235 AD, the Roman Empire experienced growing instability, rising corruption, and an increasing reliance on the military to uphold imperial authority, all of which ultimately paved the way for the infamous crisis of the 3rd century. During the years of the crisis, the Roman state faced rapid and violent successions as emperors were frequently assassinated by their own troops. Rival generals often secured military loyalty by offering lavish rewards to the soldiers, turning the army into the ultimate arbiter of power. These short-lived rulers, elevated from the ranks of the army, became known as barracks emperors. As authority shifted to ambitious provincial generals, Rome's traditional elite, including the long-weakened Senate, was increasingly pushed aside. Inflation soared as the government debased its coinage to cover military costs. The situation was worsened by recurring plagues that ravaged the population. Rome's authority was increasingly challenged. Germanic tribes invaded from the north, while the newly formed Sasanian Empire pressed from the east. In 260 AD, after being defeated by Shapur I in battle, Emperor Valerian was captured by the Sasanian army and died in captivity, the first Roman emperor to meet such a fate. This series of disasters led to the fragmentation of the empire, with two breakaway states emerging, the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. Emperor Aurelian, who came to power in 270, defeated the two empires and reincorporated their territories. The Romans gave him the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. He then attempted to restore order through reforms amid internal chaos, but was assassinated in 275. He was succeeded by Tacitus, who had a promising start but died the following year, either from illness or assassination. Tacitus's brother Florian took power, but just a few days later, a general named Probus was proclaimed emperor by his troops. The two sides eventually clashed on the battlefield, and Florian was assassinated by his own men during the battle. Probus proved to be a relatively capable ruler. He halted Germanic invasions, suppressed uprisings, and began rebuilding the empire's infrastructure. However, his popularity declined among the troops due to his forcing them to do farm labor, and in 282, when a faction of the army declared a man named Carus emperor, Probus was killed by his own soldiers. When Carus came to power, he elevated his two sons, Carinus and Numerian, to the rank of Caesars. Shortly after, he successfully repelled a Sarmatian invasion and then launched a campaign against the Sassanids. He took Numerian with him in the east, while entrusting Carinus with the administration of the west. Among those accompanying Carus was Gaius Valerius Diocles, a 40-year-old Illyrian from Dalmatia with a distinguished military career. Known for his ability to inspire fierce loyalty, Diocles had served under several emperors and now held command of the Protectorus, an elite cavalry unit that acted as the emperor's personal guard. Carus advanced into Sasanian territory, capturing and sacking the capital city of Ctesiphon. However, as the army pressed deeper into enemy lands, he died suddenly. The exact cause remains uncertain. According to the Historia Augusta, he either succumbed to illness, was struck by lightning, or possibly both. Following the death of Carus, Numerian was proclaimed emperor alongside his brother Carinus. At some point during the journey back, Numerian reportedly developed an eye infection and stopped making public appearances, traveling only in a closed litter. Eventually, when soldiers grew concerned about his prolonged absence, they forced open the litter and discovered that the emperor was dead. Rumors quickly spread that he had been murdered. Amid growing suspicion, a large portion of the army declared Diocles as the new emperor. To clear his name of any involvement in Numerian's death, Diocles publicly swore before the gods that he was innocent. He then accused Numerian's father-in-law and Praetorian prefect, Lucius Flavius Apper, of the crime, drawing his sword and killing him on the spot. On November 20, 284 AD, Diocles was proclaimed emperor and adopted the Latinized form of his Greek name, Diocletianus, known to us as Diocletian. Meanwhile, Carinus, still ruling in the west, was angered by the events that had unfolded and sought to confront Diocletian. Carinus marched east while Diocletian issued proclamations and gathered military support. When the two forces finally clashed in Moesia, Diocletian was initially pushed back, but during the ensuing engagements he gained the upper hand, and Carinus was ultimately killed by his own soldiers, likely due to his unpopularity. With Carinus dead, Diocletian became the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. At the time, many Romans likely saw him as just another barracks emperor, raised by the army and destined for a short reign. But Diocletian would prove to be different. His rule would mark the beginning of a transformative era that reshaped the Roman Empire. Unlike most of the barracks emperors, Diocletian chose not to purge his rival supporters. He opted for a more conciliatory approach, retaining many in positions of power, including several magistrates and the Praetorian prefect Aristobulus. After 2 years in office, Diocletian realized that governing the empire alone was an incredibly difficult task. To secure his rule and deter rivals, especially generals who might be proclaimed emperor by their troops in distant provinces, he needed to be constantly accompanied by the bulk of the Roman army. This, however, left other regions vulnerable and required the emperor to personally respond to every threat. Additionally, the empire's administration was in disarray due to the ongoing crisis, and Rome's vast size had made it impossible for one man to govern effectively. Faced with these challenges, Diocletian concluded that sharing power was the only viable solution. As his co-emperor, he chose Marcus Aurelius Valerius Maximianus, known to us as Maximian, a fellow Illyrian from Pannonia, renowned for his loyalty, competence, and strict military discipline. In 285 AD, in a ceremony in Mediolanum, Maximian was elevated to the rank of Caesar. Only a few months later, he was promoted to Augustus. Maximian was given control of the western half of the empire, with his capital at Mogontiacum, while Diocletian took charge of the eastern half, with his capital at Nicomedia. In theory, the two men were equals, and Maximian was granted almost complete freedom to manage the West. In practice, however, Diocletian retained authority over the most important matters, particularly in administration, while Maximian largely implemented his decisions. This dynamic was symbolized in the titles they adopted during Maximian's elevation. Diocletian took the title Jovius and Maximian Herculeus, referring to their respective tutelary deities, Jupiter and Hercules. Jupiter, king of the gods and the bringer of order, represented Diocletian's role, while Hercules, a powerful hero and loyal to his father Jupiter, represented Maximian's martial strength and devotion. In 286, Maximian confronted an uprising in Gaul led by farmers and ex-soldiers, known as the Bagaudae. While he successfully suppressed the revolt, Germanic tribes, including the Alemanni, Burgundians, and the Franks, invaded the region. The Franks in particular had developed a pirate fleet that plundered settlements across the Rhine and the English Channel. While Maximian focused on the Alemanni and Burgundians, he dispatched his general Carus along with a Roman fleet and 2 legions to deal with the Franks. However, Carus soon struck a deal with them, making the Franks his allies, and declared himself Emperor of Britain and Northern Gaul. With no fleet left, Maximian realized he could not confront Carus at that time, and continued his campaigns against the Germanic tribes. Meanwhile, Diocletian learned of the difficulties Maximian faced, and after inspecting the eastern provinces, decided to aid him in the war. In the spring of 288, the 2 emperors launched a joint campaign against the Germanic tribes, employing a scorched earth strategy that devastated the enemy and temporarily reduced them to Roman clients. With Gaul now stabilized, Diocletian returned to the east. In 289, Maximian, having assembled the fleet, launched an attempt to reclaim Britain. The campaign, though, ended in failure. Despite this setback, Diocletian remained steadfast in his support of Maximian. In 290, the 2 emperors met in the city of Mediolanum to celebrate their shared rule through a series of ceremonies. Diocletian then travelled to Nicomedia, while Maximian remained in Mediolanum, and the two emperors governed their respective regions with relative stability for the next 3 years. Yet, despite the relative stability, the empire continued to suffer from the lingering effects of the crisis and the unresolved secession in Britain. Recognizing that the existing structure was inadequate for the challenges ahead, Diocletian came to a conclusion. The empire could no longer be ruled by just 2 men. His solution, the establishment of a 4-man imperial college, later known as the Tetrarchy. On the 1st of March 293 AD, in a double ceremony held in Mediolanum and Sirmium, 2 men, Constantius and Galerius, were elevated to the rank of Caesar. The empire was effectively divided into 4 parts, ruled by 2 senior Augusti and 2 junior Caesars. Constantius came from Illyria and Galerius from Thrace. Both men rose from humble origins to become accomplished and highly capable military generals. More importantly, however, they were linked to the senior emperors through marriage. Constantius had divorced his first wife, Helena, to wed Theodora, the daughter of Maximian, while Galerius had married Valeria, the daughter and only child of Diocletian. These dynastic ties helped strengthen the Tetrarchy, creating a network of loyalty designed to deter rival claims and stabilize imperial authority. Although each man would govern a fourth of the empire with considerable autonomy, Constantius and Galerius, as Caesars, remained answerable to Maximian and Diocletian, and as the original founder of both the Diarchy and the Tetrarchy, Diocletian effectively remained the leader of the 4. It's worth noting that Constantius and Galerius did not get along particularly well. However, the Tetrarchy managed to remain stable due to the strong bond of loyalty between Maximian and Diocletian, and above all, the commanding presence and leadership of Diocletian himself. The 2 Caesars were given the more troubled parts of the empire. Constantius was tasked with Gaul to deal with the usurper Carus, and Galerius was placed in charge of the Danube frontier. Maximian and Diocletian remained in the west and east respectively. Each emperor ruled from his own capital or administrative center, Diocletian from Nicomedia, Maximian from Mediolanum, Constantius from Augusta Treverorum, modern Trier, and Galerius from Sirmium and later Thessaloniki. Although the empire was divided into 4 regions, these were not rigidly defined, and in practice, the emperors could intervene in one another's spheres of responsibility when assistance was needed. As we will see, this was especially true for Galerius, who frequently operated within Diocletian's domain. Diocletian wanted to avoid setting strict territorial boundaries because he wanted to emphasize that the empire remained a single, united entity and not a collection of states. To emphasize the unity of the Tetrarchy, Diocletian created a system where the accomplishments of one emperor were celebrated as victories for all. Shared imagery in coinage and statues helped communicate this sense of unity to the people. The Tetrarchy was a bold experiment in power sharing, designed to solve the problem of rebellion and corruption by increasing imperial presence. It was intended not as a temporary solution, but as a permanent system of governance meant to continue into future generations. However, as we will see, this plan would ultimately fail. The establishment of the Tetrarchy was only the beginning of Diocletian's reforms. When he came to power, the consequences of the 3rd century crisis had left Rome with weakened imperial authority, a failing bureaucracy, a fragmented military, and rampant inflation. Diocletian recognized that stabilizing the empire required radical change. Driven by a desire to restore Rome's former glory, he introduced a wide array of reforms. Yet, in attempting to revive the past, he ultimately reshaped the empire into something entirely new. In order to restore effective governance across the vast empire, Diocletian began by overhauling its administrative framework. He oversaw a dramatic increase in the number of provinces, expanding them from around 40 to over 100. This restructuring was designed to bring provincial officers closer to local populations, enabling more effective law enforcement, functional tax collection, better infrastructure maintenance, and stronger administrative control. The newly created provinces were grouped into 12 larger administrative units called dioceses, which were then organized into 4 major prefectures. With this new system, there was now a clear chain of command. Each prefecture was governed by an emperor. Directly below the emperor was the praetorian prefect, his right-hand man. Each diocese was ruled by a vicarius, who was responsible for enacting the orders of the emperor and the prefect. The provinces were managed by governors who reported to the vicarius. Beneath the governors were the officials responsible for each city within the province. Both governors and officials were tasked with administering justice, maintaining public order, overseeing infrastructure, and managing tax collection. Alongside the restructured government, Diocletian established a vast and complex bureaucracy, introducing numerous administrative positions that worked in conjunction with the government officials. As a result of this bureaucratic expansion, the number of civil servants grew from approximately 15,000 people to 30,000. During the crisis, most bureaucratic positions had been filled by soldiers. When Diocletian implemented his reforms, he sent these soldiers back to the frontiers and replaced them with civilians, but maintained the strict chain of command typical of the military within the new bureaucracy. Officials were organized into units, each reporting up a clear hierarchy to senior administrators, the praetorian prefect, and ultimately the emperor. Civil servants even wore military cloaks and belts in place of traditional togas. Most bureaucratic officials were responsible for tasks like censuses, property assessments, and tax collection. However, some served within the emperor's new mobile court or council, which traveled with him wherever he was needed. The court was organized into special departments called scrinia, each headed by a senior official. The entire civil service was overseen by the praetorian prefect. Thanks to this new system, along with the revamped postal network, the empire's bureaucracy became highly efficient. Alongside his administrative reforms, Diocletian aimed to eliminate the last remnants of senatorial power. While the Senate had lost much of its real authority since Augustus, emperors had continued to uphold the illusion of senatorial influence through formal meetings and by allowing senators to administer certain provinces. Many emperors had come from the Senate, and senators often participated in imperial councils. However, as we mentioned, during the crisis, power had shifted to military men of humble origins from across the empire, sidelining Rome's aristocracy. Diocletian sought a firm and strict line of authority and saw little need for the Senate. As a result, he stripped them of their remaining privileges. Senators lost any real decision-making power, and the new emperors no longer included them in their entourage. Under Diocletian's reforms, they were barred from governing major regions like Egypt or Gaul, with their authority now restricted primarily to provinces in Italy. Most administrative and bureaucratic positions, including high offices such as those of the vicarius and the prefect, were taken over by members of the equites, the equestrian class. Aside from governing the limited provinces, the only remaining positions available to senators were the office of Rome's urban prefect or mayor and the consulship, which was mostly ceremonial. In addition to stripping the Senate of its privileges, Diocletian also eliminated the special status long enjoyed by 2 key regions, Italy and Egypt. Italy, as the empire's traditional heartland, had been exempt from taxation for centuries. While Egypt was not tax-exempt, it held unique privileges, such as minting its own coins, using its own calendar, and sometimes operating outside Roman law. Diocletian abolished all of these exceptions. Only the city of Rome and its immediate surroundings remained exempt from taxes, due to the symbolic prestige of the Eternal City. Notably, as we have seen, up until this point, Diocletian has never once visited Rome, and he would only do so near the end of his reign. Beyond the practical concerns of dealing with frontier crisis and reorganizing the administration, this deliberate absence sent a clear message. Rome was no longer the center of imperial power. Though a proud Roman himself, Diocletian was born in Illyria and felt no emotional attachment to either Italy or the city of Rome, unlike many earlier emperors that came from the Italian aristocracy. The neglect of the city by Diocletian, as well as by the many barracks emperors before him, along with the establishment of new provincial capitals by the Tetrarchs, marked the beginning of the decline of Rome's strategic and ideological primacy. However, the presence of emperors in various cities did not necessarily result in widespread urban prosperity. While it is true that the emperors invested in their capitals, building public structures and palaces, the decline of Rome's importance, unique character and prestige seemed to foreshadow a broader pattern, one that would eventually affect hundreds of cities across the empire. During the 3rd century crisis, many cities went to a steep decline due to political instability and economic hardship. Once vibrant urban centers, sustained by wealthy local elites who funded public works and religious life, began to deteriorate as those elites lost influence and power. Diocletian's reforms accelerated this process as his rigid, top-down autocratic system further eroded urban autonomy. Holding local office became more of a burden than an honor, as city officials were now mostly responsible for tax collection while having little real authority, with power centralized in the hands of provincial governors. More significantly, these officials were frequently outsiders with no ties to the cities they governed and little regard for local traditions. As a result, religious festivals and civic projects diminished, and traditional privileges such as the ability to mend coins were stripped away. With their distinct character and autonomy fading, cities lost much of their local pride, and regional identity steadily gave way to a more uniform imperial identity. We should mention that this was not the case for all cities, but it was the case for most of them. One telling example of the loss of regional autonomy is the case of Antioch. When a local usurper launched a revolt, the city's officials raised an army and defeated him. But instead of being rewarded, they were punished for bypassing the chain of command, even though their actions served the empire's interests. Diocletian ordered the execution of the leaders, sending a clear message that no initiative was allowed without imperial approval. Speaking of imperial power, what is interesting is how Diocletian transformed both the authority and the image of the emperor. During the turbulent years of the 3rd century, the Praetorian Guard, along with the legions, realized how easy it practically was to overthrow an emperor. This led to a volatile situation, where emperors were often assassinated and replaced on a whim, as soldiers sought gifts or rewards for their support. Consequently, any general with enough power could declare himself emperor, which is arguably how Diocletian rose to power. Diocletian, however, wanted to change this dynamic. To achieve this, he dramatically altered the image and prestige of the emperor. No longer was the emperor the princeps, or first citizen, pretending to be an approachable leader. From then on, he was the dominus, the lord of the empire. Rather than basing his authority on military or senatorial approval, Diocletian grounded it in divine power and sought to reframe the emperor as a figure of reverence and an earthly agent of the gods. Thus, he emphasized majesty and supreme authority. Court rituals required officials to stand while he sat, and visitors had to prostrate themselves before him, kissing his robe or hand as a sign of submission. He adorned himself in royal symbols such as the diadem and draped himself in jewels. As power became centralized and the Senate's influence diminished, the imperial office assumed a more autocratic and quasi-divine character, fundamentally transforming the political, social, and ideological fabric of Rome. By the late 3rd century, the Roman military system had become outdated. It no longer met the needs of an empire facing increasingly coordinated and large-scale invasions. Diocletian initiated a restructuring of the military, reforming both its organization and its relationship to the state. A critical part of Diocletian's reform was dismantling the traditional fusion of civil and military authority. No longer would provincial governors command both the legions and the local economy, powers that had so often tempted the ambitious men to rebellion. Civilian administration remained in the hands of governors, while military command was transferred to newly appointed officers called duces. These duces could oversee troops within a single province or across several, depending on strategic needs. Additionally, the structure of the Roman army itself was transformed. Although most of the old legions were retained, Diocletian oversaw the creation of new units that were smaller and far more mobile, typically consisting of about 1,000 to 1,500 men. These units, called comitatenses, were stationed in strategic towns and fortresses and were commanded by officials known as comites. Unlike the older legions, they featured a significantly larger cavalry component to enhance speed and flexibility. Alongside the creation of the comitatenses, Diocletian either established or laid the groundwork for the limitani, frontier troops typically drawn from local populations. These part-time soldier farmers served as the first line of defense, monitoring threats and delaying enemy advances long enough for the comitatenses to respond. This two-tiered system gave the empire a long missing degree of strategic flexibility. Through these reforms, the army was expanded from approximately 250,000 men to around 400 to 500,000. Diocletian also undertook a vast expansion of the empire's defensive infrastructure. Walls were constructed around most cities and towns near the frontiers. In addition, thousands of forts and castles were built. Although Diocletian's military reforms were largely successful in stabilizing the frontiers, they came at a significant cost. The expansion of the army strained the economy and accelerated the militarization of Roman society. Recruitment drew on voluntary enlistment, mandatory conscription, hereditary military obligation, where soldiers' sons were bound to serve after their fathers, and through attacks which required landowners to supply manpower. This system pulled farmers away from their fields or forced them to finance soldiers, reducing agricultural productivity. Another major consequence was the growing reliance on foreign recruits. As Rome's demand for manpower increased, soldiers from barbarian tribes filled much of the army's ranks, gradually eroding the distinctly Roman identity the military had once held. When Diocletian rose to power in 284 AD, he was faced with rampant inflation and a completely disorganized taxation system. Diocletian standardized taxes into two primary forms: a property tax and a personal tax. The property tax was universally applied to landowners and assessed based on the size and productivity of their land. It was mostly collected in kind due to rampant inflation and the unreliability of monetary transactions. The personal tax primarily targeted the rural lower classes who did not own land. Furthermore, Diocletian ordered that frequent censuses across the empire should be done to maintain an up-to-date and accurate tax base. By shifting the empire's fiscal foundation from unreliable cash payments to predictable assessments of land, labor, and goods, Diocletian ensured that the state could feed and clothe its armies, pay its officials, and continue functioning, even as the economy remained deeply unstable. As we previously mentioned, during the crisis of the 3rd century, successive emperors had debased the coinage in a desperate effort to stretch limited resources, reducing the precious metal content of coins while trying to maintain their nominal value. This led to a vicious cycle of inflation, where the real value of money plummeted and barter increasingly replaced currency transactions. To restore confidence in the currency, Diocletian introduced new coins such as the argenteus and the solidus. Diocletian launched an extensive recoinage campaign through state-controlled mints. Simultaneously, he curbed private minting to maintain imperial control over the supply. Despite his efforts, inflation persisted, and so in 301 AD, Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices to impose direct government control over the economy. The edict set fixed maximum prices for a vast range of goods and services throughout the empire and imposed harsh penalties, including execution for profiteering or violating price caps. The law aimed to curb greed and stabilize the cost of living for both soldiers and civilians. In practice, however, it failed. Enforcement was inconsistent, and most people resorted to illegal transactions. The rigid price controls, disconnected from the realities of supply and demand, disrupted trade and deepened economic distortions. Another issue for the economy that is often forgotten arose from the fact that since the empire ceased expanding, the influx of new slaves, which had been crucial for the Roman economy, effectively stopped. As a result, during late antiquity, the empire had to adapt to new economic realities. Beyond monetary and fiscal policy, Diocletian sought to impose broader social discipline as part of his economic program. He issued sumptuary laws to curb extravagance among the wealthy and stabilize consumption patterns. Recognizing that the survival of the imperial system depended not only on coins and goods, but also on a productive and stable labor force, Diocletian attempted to bind essential workers to their trades. While this effort largely failed, one notable success was the establishment of the colony, or tenant farmers. The colony were legally tied to the land they worked, and their descendants were obligated to continue farming the same land. Although they were not slaves or serfs, since they could own property, including their own houses, this system represented a shift toward more controlled labor. Diocletian's sweeping changes transformed the empire, transitioning it from the Rome of classical antiquity to that of late antiquity. In doing so, he laid the groundwork for many of the medieval structures that would come to define Europe in the next centuries. Having outlined Diocletian's reforms, we now return to the main thread of our story. As we discussed earlier, when Constantius joined the Imperial College in 293, he faced a daunting challenge: the recapture of Britain. The island was under the control of Carus, a usurper who had established his rule with the support of the Franks. The Franks posed a serious threat, with substantial land forces and a strong naval presence across the Rhine and the English Channel. They controlled key coastal positions, most notably the port of Gessoriacum, a vital hub for resupply and maintaining the connection between Britain and the mainland. Recognizing Gessoriacum's strategic importance, Constantius made it his first target. He laid siege to the city, constructing a dam to block access to the sea and cut off supply routes. Isolated and unable to hold out, the city eventually surrendered. Shortly afterward, Carus was assassinated in a coup led by one of his ministers, Allectus, who declared himself the new emperor of Britain. Over the next 2 years, Constantius campaigned against the Franks to secure the region before invading Britain. By 295, with the area pacified and a new fleet prepared, Maximian moved to the Rhine frontier, clearing the way for Constantius to begin his campaign against Allectus. Constantius split his army into two forces, one under his own command and the other led by his praetorian prefect Asclepiodatus, with the aim of landing at different locations to confuse and outmaneuver Allectus. Asclepiodatus was the first to reach Britain and began marching toward Londinium. Caught off guard by the unexpected landing point, Allectus hastily mobilized to intercept him, leaving part of his army, mostly Frankish mercenaries, behind in the rush. His forces, poorly organized and unprepared, encountered Asclepiodatus en route to Londinium and were defeated in battle. Allectus himself was killed in the fighting. With the commander dead and no orders to follow, the stranded Frankish mercenaries turned to looting and plundering the countryside. Subsequently, Constantius with his part of the army landed in Britain and advanced toward Londinium, where he encountered the marauding Franks. He quickly defeated them and entered the city as a hero. Thus, Britain was restored to the empire. With Britain secured and Constantius returning to Gaul, Maximian turned his focus to North Africa in late 296, where the Quinquegentiani, a confederation of Berber tribes, had been raiding Roman provinces for years. He launched a campaign against them, and after a protracted conflict lasting until early 298, he succeeded in decisively defeating the tribes and driving them back into the desert. Maximian then celebrated his victory in Carthage and later in Rome, before returning to Mediolanum. Meanwhile, in the east, events were unfolding in parallel. Immediately after Galerius was appointed Caesar in 293, Diocletian dispatched him to Upper Egypt to quell a revolt in the Thebaid, in the cities of Busiris and Coptus, a mission he successfully accomplished. During his time in the region, Galerius fought against the Nubians and the Blemmyes, a tribe of the Eastern Sahara, and emerged victorious. After securing Upper Egypt, Galerius headed to Syria in 294. In the meantime, in the neighboring Sasanian Empire, Narser, the youngest son of Shapur I, overthrew his nephew and became the new King of Kings. Narser aimed to restore the past military glory of his empire and broke the peace established with Rome by invading Upper Mesopotamia in 296. Galerius quickly mustered an army to halt Narser's advance and confronted him near the city of Edessa. The first two engagements ended in stalemates, but in the third, Galerius suffered a crushing defeat to the superior Iranian cavalry. Despite this, the Sasanians suffered enough losses to halt their progress, and Diocletian soon arrived with reinforcements to prevent further advancement. As Galerius traveled to the Balkans to raise new troops, Narser invaded western Armenia, a Roman client state, and deposed its king, Tiridates III. At the same time, a new revolt erupted in Egypt. It was driven by opposition to Diocletian's new reforms, which revoked traditional privileges and imposed stricter taxation. In 297, the rebels rallied behind a man named Domitius Domitianus, who declared himself Augustus. Since Galerius was charged with fighting the Sasanians, Diocletian personally led the campaign to suppress the revolt. He pacified the countryside before besieging Alexandria for several months. Eventually, Domitianus died and the city surrendered, reaffirming the Tetrarchy's control over Egypt. During the winter of 297 and 298, Narser and the Sasanian army had encamped in western Armenia. Galerius could wait for the spring or summer to come in order to confront Narser, but he decided to take a bold step. He led an army of 25,000 Romans, reinforced by Armenian troops, through the snow-covered mountains and set up camp near the city of Satala. According to one source, Galerius personally infiltrated the Sasanian camp disguised as a cabbage seller, with 2 Armenian nobles accompanying him, and located a weak point in their defenses. Another source claimed he scouted the camp on horseback at night. Regardless, the weak spot was identified, and during a heavy snowfall the next day, Galerius launched a surprise attack from the surrounding woods. The Sasanians were caught completely off guard. Their army was annihilated, Narser was wounded and fled, and the Romans captured his wife, his harem, the royal treasury, and numerous war elephants. With the Sasanian Empire crippled in the west and Narser in retreat, Galerius advanced into Mesopotamia, sacking numerous cities until reaching Gundashapur. Facing total collapse, Narser was forced to sue for peace. He ceded Armenia along with Caucasian Albania and Iberia, which were made Roman client states. In the aftermath, a peace agreement was established between the Romans and the Sasanians, ensuring stability for the next 40 years. Diocletian remained in the east to oversee the region, while Galerius returned west, where he celebrated his victory with a triumph. In the following years, both emperors supervised the construction of hundreds of stone forts along the Danube and eastern frontiers and issued edicts to curb corruption among tax and debt collectors. Until 303 AD, the Tetrarchs remained focused on implementing Diocletian's reforms. The final significant policy of Diocletian's reign was his implementation of the greatest persecution of Christians in Roman history. Before discussing the persecution itself, it is important to first examine its underlying causes, which are rooted in the broader religious and political transformations occurring within the empire. Christianity had long been viewed with suspicion by Roman authorities. But despite persecutions under emperors like Nero, Domitian, and Decius, Christianity had steadily grown over the course of 2 centuries. By the time Diocletian came to power in 284, Christianity was a significant and rapidly expanding religious movement. Estimates suggest that Christians made up around 7 to 10% of the empire's population. Although this might seem like a relatively small figure, it's important to note that Christianity was predominantly an urban religion. While Christians were nearly absent in rural areas and villages, in many cities they made up as much as half of the population, making Christianity a prominent and influential force. Diocletian, who rose to power following a period of great turmoil, was intent on restoring unity and stability to the empire. His reforms aimed to strengthen central authority and reinforce traditional Roman religious practices, which he saw as crucial to the state's well-being. Christianity's refusal to venerate the emperor as divine and its denouncement of Roman gods posed a direct challenge to this system. Additionally, many Christians across the empire refused to comply with mandatory military conscription. Even more troubling for Diocletian was the fact that Christianity had over the centuries developed a highly organized system of priesthood with a clear hierarchy. Christians had, in effect, formed a state within a state, which Diocletian saw as a serious threat to imperial authority. Before turning his attention to the Christians, Diocletian had already targeted another religious group with a relatively similar theology and organizational structure, the Manichaeans. Originating in Iran, Manichaeism was a syncretic faith that blended elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and other religions. Like Christianity, Diocletian viewed Manichaeism as a threat to the unity of the empire. In 297, he issued a series of edicts against the Manichaeans, particularly in Egypt, leading to the execution of the religious leaders and the destruction of the sacred texts. This persecution lasted almost a decade, effectively eliminating Manichaeism from the Roman Empire, although the faith continued to flourish in the East. By the year 300, Diocletian began focusing more intensively on the growing Christian presence, especially within the military. The army, traditionally loyal to the state gods, now included many Christians who refused to participate in sacrifices to the Roman pantheon. This was seen as a direct challenge to the emperor's authority, which was tied to the veneration of the gods, including the deification of the emperor himself. For Diocletian, the loyalty of the army was paramount. This tension culminated in an official edict that required all soldiers to participate in sacrifices to the gods. Those who refused faced dishonorable discharge, imprisonment, or, in some cases, execution, particularly if they belonged to a predominantly Christian legion. In 302 AD, Diocletian and Galerius held a public sacrifice to seek divine omens for their future. During the ceremony, some of the members of Diocletian's household painted the sign of the cross on their foreheads to ward off the gods they deemed evil, which disrupted the proceedings. Enraged by this act, Diocletian demanded that his household staff perform sacrifices or face punishment. This incident prompted a series of council meetings, and with the support of his advisors and of Galerius, a staunch opponent of Christianity, Diocletian resolved to launch a systematic campaign against the Christians. Thus, the Great Persecution officially began in 303 with the issuance of the First Imperial Edict. Churches were ordered to be destroyed, Christian scriptures were to be burned, and Christian assemblies became prohibited. Over the next 2 years, the persecution escalated with the issuance of the Second and Third Edicts, which ordered Christian leaders to perform sacrifices to the gods or face arrest, imprisonment, and execution. In 304, the fourth and final edict was issued, mandating that all citizens, pagan or not, participate in public sacrifices. Those who refused faced arrest, public shaming, torture, and execution. While the edicts were absolute, their enforcement varied widely across the empire. Local officials and governors, some of whom had Christian family members or friends, often carried out the persecution with varying levels of enthusiasm. In the East, particularly under Galerius, the persecution was brutal and widespread, while in the West, especially under Constantius, it was less aggressive and focused more on the destruction of Christian buildings than on mass executions. For many non-Christians, the Great Persecution was shocking, as large-scale campaigns targeting religious groups were virtually unheard of in the Roman Empire prior to the 4th century. The reasons for the persecution were often incomprehensible to the general populace, especially given that Christians were largely peaceful, tax-paying citizens. Despite the scale of the Great Persecution, Christianity survived due to 3 key factors. Firstly, as we mentioned, the enforcement of the edicts varied significantly across the empire. Many local officials, either indifferent or sympathetic, chose to overlook violations or enforce the laws leniently. Secondly, the executions of prominent Christian leaders often had the unintended effect of strengthening the resolve of the faithful, as the courage and steadfastness of the martyrs became powerful symbols of spiritual strength. And thirdly, many Christians chose to comply outwardly with the imperial edicts by performing the required public sacrifices while continuing to pray in private. When Christianity was eventually legalized, these acts of compromise sparked intense debate within the church, particularly regarding whether those who had capitulated should be allowed to return. Ultimately, the majority were readmitted after undergoing appropriate acts of penance. The persecution would continue until the Edict of Toleration issued by Galerius in 311 AD. We will explore this further in the next video on Roman history. In 303 AD, the same year the first anti-Christian edict was issued, Diocletian made his first visit to Rome. As we mentioned, until then, he had deliberately avoided the city, viewing it as politically obsolete and morally corrupt. Nevertheless, he chose this moment to visit the capital in order to commemorate two major milestones: the 10th anniversary of Galerius and Constantius being elevated to the rank of Caesar, and the 20th anniversary of his accession to the imperial throne. The celebrations would include lavish games, festivals, and religious ceremonies, and Diocletian and Maximian were to receive consulships. Having never set foot in Rome before, Diocletian would also take the opportunity to inspect the various architectural projects he had commissioned in the capital. But as the games and festivals began, Diocletian quickly grew disillusioned. He was appalled by the excess and decadence that marked the city's celebrations. Furthermore, he found the Roman people far too bold and steeped in outdated republican ideals. They addressed him not as Dominus, but merely as Princeps, the first citizen, treating him as little more than one of their own, with none of the reverence shown to him in the provinces. The experience solidified Diocletian's disdain for the capital. Just weeks into his stay, much to the dismay of the Romans, he abruptly cut his visit short, declining to receive the consulship on the Capitoline Hill as was customary. Instead, he chose to accept it on the road and began his journey back to his capital, Nicomedia. His journey, though, was marred by a sudden and severe illness. As his condition rapidly declined, he became so debilitated that he had to be transported in a closed litter. By the time he reached Nicomedia in mid-304, he was completely incapacitated and unable to govern. In the following period, Galerius increasingly assumed the responsibilities of leadership. Given the gravity of Diocletian's condition, many believed he would not survive. But against expectations, he finally recovered in the spring of 305. In a move that stunned the empire, Diocletian, now gaunt and aged, announced his decision to abdicate the throne, something no Roman emperor had ever done. Whether his decision had long been part of his plan or was prompted by his illness remains a matter of speculation. However, it is evident that his deteriorating health hastened the process and underscored the need for a strong, active leader at Rome's helm. He also decided that Maximian would abdicate alongside him. Diocletian's idea behind this simultaneous abdication was to ensure an orderly transfer of power. Unlike Diocletian, however, Maximian was not at all interested in abdication. Nevertheless, out of loyalty to his fellow Augustus and longtime comrade, he agreed to follow suit. Thus, on May 1st, 305, Diocletian and Maximian, the two most powerful men in the empire, formally stepped down and relinquished absolute power. Galerius and Constantius were both elevated to the rank of Augustus. The problem was that they did not particularly like each other and held differing views on many key issues. This relationship stood in sharp contrast to the partnership between Diocletian and Maximian, whose personal bond and Diocletian's overarching authority had kept the Tetrarchy stable. The real controversy, though, emerged with the appointment of the new Caesars. Rather than promoting the obvious heirs, Constantine, son of Constantius, and Maxentius, son of Maximian, Diocletian selected Maximinus and Severus, two military men. This decision was supposed to reflect a preference for merit over hereditary succession. However, the choice of these specific individuals was likely influenced by Galerius, as Maximinus was his nephew and Severus a close friend. With both Caesars now loyal to Galerius, he emerged as a dominant figure in the new imperial college. Constantius in turn felt his influence diminishing, especially after the exclusion of his son Constantine, who had seemed a natural candidate for succession. Maximian, though officially retired, also remained a volatile presence, frustrated by the dismissal of his son and eventually regretting his abdication. The exclusion of Constantine and Maxentius created two powerful centers of potential opposition outside the imperial college, which was an already fragile structure. Without Diocletian's guiding hand to mediate disputes and enforce unity, the Tetrarchy would soon begin to fall apart. In the next video on Roman history, we will discuss the fall of the Tetrarchy and the rise of Constantine to power. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos.